You walked into the room, nobody called your name, nobody pulled you into the conversation, but by the time you left, you already knew who was uncomfortable in their own skin, who was performing confidence they didn't actually feel, and who was one difficult question away from completely falling apart. You didn't analyze any of it deliberately. You didn't sit there running calculations. You just knew, the way you always know. And then you went home, sat with all of it, and said nothing to anyone. Because how do you even begin to explain something that feels less like a skill and more like a frequency you were born tuned into? Most people assume that staying quiet in a room means you're disengaged, checked out, maybe a little awkward, maybe a little lost. The world tends to reward the loudest voice in the space, the one who takes up air, who drives the energy, who makes themselves impossible to miss. And when you're not doing that, there's a quiet social verdict that gets handed down without anyone saying it directly. They assume you have less going on, less to offer, less awareness of what's happening around you. That assumption is one of the most consistently wrong reads one person can make about another. Because while the loudest person in the room is busy being seen, you are busy seeing. And those are two completely different activities with two completely different outcomes. This is about quiet people, not shy in the clinical sense, not introverted by textbook definition alone. Quiet, the specific kind of person who sits at the edge of a conversation and absorbs everything inside it. The ones who notice what people deliberately don't say just as clearly as what they do say. The ones who can feel the temperature of a room shift 3 exchanges before anyone else registers the change. The ones who read people the way a careful reader reads a dense novel, not rushing toward the ending, but catching every loaded word, every hesitation, every detail buried between the lines. And what science has been quietly confirming for decades now is this: that kind of perception is not accidental. It is not a personality quirk. It is not a consolation prize for people who couldn't figure out how to be louder. It is a deeply wired cognitive style, one with real biology behind it, real developmental roots beneath it, and real trade-offs running through the middle of it that most people never fully understand. Neuroscientists studying something called sensory processing sensitivity found that roughly 15 to 20% of the human population processes environmental and emotional information at a significantly deeper level than the majority. And the critical word there is deeper, not better, not more correct, but more thorough. The brain pauses longer before forming a response. It cross-references more emotional data in real time. It holds more contextual threads in working memory during a single social interaction than the average brain does simultaneously. Dr. Elaine Aron, who spent decades building the research foundation on this trait, found that these individuals aren't simply reacting to more stimuli, they are processing each piece of incoming information more completely before releasing a reaction. Brain imaging studies showed that when highly sensitive individuals were shown photographs of emotional expressions, faces carrying grief or tension or barely concealed fear, their brains activated significantly more regions associated with awareness, empathy, and action planning than the average brain activated viewing the same image. That is not fragility dressed up in scientific language. That is an extraordinarily sophisticated biological instrument running at a resolution most people don't have access to. But the biology alone doesn't explain how it got this sharp. For most quiet observers, this level of perceptual attention was not simply inherited and left alone. It was conditioned, sharpened by experience. Childhood environments that were emotionally unpredictable, households where the mood of a parent determined the safety of a room, where conflict arrived without warning, where the right read of a situation was the difference between a calm evening and a tense one, those environments train the nervous system to stay permanently alert, to scan before entering, to measure emotional temperature before speaking, to build an internal catalog of human behavioral patterns so detailed, so layered, that by adulthood you can sense something shifting in a person before they've consciously identified themselves. Psychologists call the chronic version of this hypervigilance, and they're right to name the cost. But what often gets lost in that framing is this: the alarm system and the sensor are not the same thing. The anxiety that once drove the attention can be separated from the perceptual capacity itself. The skill outlives the wound, and many quiet observers reach adulthood carrying the sensor without the alarm, moving through rooms with a low-frequency awareness that operates below the level most people even know to look for.
They notice when someone's laughter doesn't quite reach their eyes. They notice when a confident person pauses half a second too long before answering a question they should know easily. They notice when a couple in a restaurant is having the kind of silence that used to be comfortable and recently stopped being. They notice the exact moment a meeting shifts from productive to performative, and they file all of it away, not because they're trying to, but because their brains simply won't let it pass without processing. Now, and this matters, none of this makes quiet observers superior. Let's hold that line clearly and not move from it. There are people who think fast and speak first who have built entire industries, led movements, and changed the direction of rooms through sheer force of expressed momentum. The brain that processes quickly and acts decisively has accomplished things the slower, deeper processor would still be analyzing. The world is built by both. Fast processing generates speed and action. Deep processing generates accuracy and understanding. They are different instruments designed for different problems, and no honest conversation about this treats one as the winner. But here is what doesn't get said nearly enough. The quiet observer pays a price that is rarely acknowledged. Noticing everything means carrying everything. When you can see that someone close to you is deteriorating beneath a composed surface, you cannot unsee it. When you know a relationship is beginning to fracture before either person inside it has admitted it to themselves, you sit with that knowledge alone, because saying it out loud sounds like an accusation, and staying quiet feels like complicity. When you walk into a social situation and absorb the undercurrent of every dynamic in the room, you leave that situation carrying weight that nobody else walked out with. The same depth of perception that allows profound understanding also makes genuine rest harder to find. And underneath all of that is a quiet paradox that defines so much of this experience. You understand people at a level very few others reach, and yet you often feel profoundly unseen yourself. You give your attention generously, almost involuntarily, to nearly everyone around you, and you wonder, sometimes in ways you don't say out loud, whether anyone is paying that same quality of attention back. That is not a small thing. It deserves to be named honestly, not smoothed over with reassurance. Because once you understand why the glass fills faster, you can learn how to empty it deliberately, before it overflows into exhaustion, withdrawal, or a slow accumulation of resentment that even you can't fully explain. Here is one mental shift that creates real, practical change. Begin treating your perception as a finite resource with a capacity limit, rather than a passive experience that simply happens to you. The quiet observer tends to distribute their attention across every person, every dynamic, every undercurrent in the room, absorbing all of it without ever deciding whether that's the best use of what they carry. Start choosing. One conversation, one person, one space where your depth of attention is actually wanted and used. Instead of passively receiving the full emotional weight of every room you enter, consciously direct where that perception lands. This is not about shutting down your awareness. It is about governing it. The difference between a floodlight left on all night and a focused beam aimed with intention. It sounds like a subtle shift, but for someone wired the way you are, it can be the difference between being consumed by what you notice and actually doing something meaningful with it. Your silence was never absence. It was never passivity dressed up as personality. It was attention. It was the kind of steady, patient, high-resolution attention that most people spend years trying to develop, and that you have been quietly carrying since you were young enough to read a room and know when something was wrong before anyone said a word. There's a reason the people who matter most in your life eventually say some version of the same thing. You understood me before I understood myself. That was never a coincidence. That was you, doing what you have always done, in the way only you know how. If this felt like something you've spent a long time waiting for someone to finally say out loud, there's more. Because how a quiet mind sees people is only the first layer of the story. The more interesting question is what happens when that mind finally learns to turn that same quality of attention inward, and where that leads is somewhere most people don't expect.